Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling a really crucial issue, one that's obviously dominating global headlines, and with the attempted ceasefire. Uh, you know, kind of holding precariously in Ukraine right now, and alongside that, we've seen some interesting diplomatic efforts as well. The truce talks recently in Riyadh, for instance. But really, at the core of what we're going to look at with you today is this question. We're talking about solidifying that ceasefire, actually building a lasting peace in Ukraine. Who should actually be leading a peacekeeping force?
Yeah, it's definitely a key moment right now. I mean, as you say, like the guns might be a little quieter right now, but the bigger question and the harder task is how do you actually create, that durable peace that everyone's hoping for? And that's where this whole question of who's actually composing a peacekeeping force, who's leading it, that becomes absolutely, central to whether it can even succeed.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, looking at what's kind of on the table right now, there seem to be two main possibilities for who would actually make up this force. Um, the first one that we're seeing discussed quite a bit is the idea of a European-led initiative. And we've heard some pretty prominent voices, weighing in on this possibility, haven't we?
We have, yeah. I mean, people like British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, French President Emmanuel Macron, they've both signaled that they're open to the idea of European nations, contributing troops. And on the surface, I mean, it kind of makes sense, right? When you think about it geographically, they're right. Europe has a huge stake in seeing, regional stability in that part of the world. So
It feels logical, right? Europe's right there. The stability of Ukraine, obviously,
yeah.
it has huge implications for the entire continent. But then almost as soon as you start thinking about that, you run into a pretty big roadblock, and that's Russia's stance on all of this, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they're pretty firmly against any kind of peacekeeping force that has ties to NATO.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for Moscow, that's a non-starter. They've made that very, very clear. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. I mean, he's said in no uncertain terms that, having a NATO-affiliated presence would essentially just pour more fuel on the fire. It would make the conflict worse. It would stop any attempts to actually, de-escalate the situation. So that's a pretty strong signal.
Absolutely, no doubt about it. It throws a wrench in the works,
Yeah.
right, for that European-led idea. So then you have the second option that people are talking about, and that's this idea of a peacekeeping coalition. But this time, it would be drawn from the global south.
Hmm.
So, we're talking countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America. And ideally, this would be operating, with the back of the UN. And the thinking here seems to be that this might be seen as, kind of a more neutral option and therefore more palatable, to all the players involved.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, the logic here is that, if you have a force that's made up of countries that don't have that same, kind of historical baggage or the same kind of direct involvement in, the current geopolitical tensions, they might be seen as more impartial, right? And therefore, they might be able to build that trust with all sides, including Russia.
Okay, so that's the kind of lay of the land. That's the challenge we're looking at. And it really brings us to what we want to do in this deep dive today. So we want to really dig into these two paths, right? The European-led force versus that global South coalition, and really try to understand which one might actually stand a better chance of creating a lasting peace in Ukraine. And we're going to be looking at it from all angles, the strategic considerations, the political dynamics, even just, how each of these options might be perceived by the different actors involved. And we're going to be drawing directly from, some of the analysis that we've been looking at.
Exactly. So yeah, let's start maybe by kind of unpacking, why this seemingly, straightforward idea of a European-led force might actually be a lot trickier than it might seem at first glance.
All right, let's unpack it.
Yeah.
So as we said, I mean, on the surface, it seems to make sense, right? Europe's close by. They obviously have a stake in the outcome. But then you start digging a little deeper. You start factoring things like Russia's perspective, and it gets complicated pretty quickly.
Yeah, it does. And from Moscow's point of view, I mean, Lavrov really articulated this pretty clearly. Or they essentially see a European-led force is pretty much the same thing as a NATO deployment. It's a continuation of what they see as NATO expansion, even if the troops on the ground aren't officially under the NATO banner. But it's that perception, right? Regardless of whether that's objectively true or not, it's that perception that really matters because it feeds directly into that lack of trust that already exists between all these different parties. And as we know, without trust, the chances of things, flaring up again, of the conflict reigniting that becomes a much, much bigger risk.
Right. It's all about how it's viewed.
Yeah.
Even if, intentions are good, if the goal really is just to keep the peace, the fact is that historical context, the geopolitical environment, it all colors how that action is going to be interpreted.
Yeah.
And it's not just about Russia's reaction either, right? I mean, there seem to be some pretty big challenges, within Europe itself when it comes to the idea of actually committing troops,
Yeah.
to a peacekeeping operation.
Yeah, that's a really important point. I mean, even if you have certain leaders who are saying, yeah, we're willing to contribute troops, you have to then look at, is there actually the political will, across the board to send, potentially large numbers of soldiers into a situation that is still, extremely volatile.
Mm-hmm.
And we've already seen, signs of this, for example, in France. There were public opinion polls that suggested that there was, massive pushback against Macron, even suggesting that, French troops might be sent. So that kind of domestic pressure, that can be a real, obstacle for any kind of large-scale, European-led peacekeeping effort.
Mm. So even if you could somehow get past Russia's objections, even if you had, the logistical side of things figured out, you still have this fundamental question of impartiality, right?
Mm.
I mean, how can a group of countries that are so closely aligned, with one side in this conflict, how can they actually be seen as neutral peacekeepers?
Yeah, it's a tricky thing, right? I mean, regardless of how much money, how many resources, European countries might be able to bring to the table, that perception of bias is probably going to linger. And when it comes to peacekeeping, that perception can be just as important as, the reality of how neutral they actually are. Because if one side, if one of the parties involved doesn't trust the peacekeepers, then they're not going to be able to do their job.
Right. Okay. So the European option, it seems like it's facing, some pretty stiff headwinds. Let's shift gears then and talk about, the arguments in favor of a Global South peacekeeping coalition. What are the big points that make this idea, potentially appealing?
Well, one of the things that this analysis really emphasizes is this idea of a legacy of principled neutrality. And it's important to understand that this isn't just, some kind of strategic ambiguity about not wanting to choose sides in a particular conflict. For a lot of the nations in the Global South, this idea of non-alignment, it represents a much deeper commitment.
Mm-hmm.
It's about peaceful coexistence. It's about respecting the sovereignty of other nations. These are not just talking points, for diplomats. These are fundamental principles that have been enshrined, in the charters of the UN, the non-aligned movement, and they've really shaped, foreign policy for decades.
So it's not just about not taking sides, in this particular situation. It's a much more deeply rooted kind of historical and philosophical stance.
Yeah.
Okay, so how does that translate into, their actual ability to carry out, peacekeeping operations?
Well, that's where this idea of diplomatic and operational readiness comes in. The Global South actually has, a pretty impressive track record when it comes to peacekeeping. Countries like India, Brazil, South Africa, they've been contributing troops and resources to UN missions for decades.
Right.
And these have been in, some of the most complex, some of the most dangerous parts of the world. They've dealt with everything from really intricate civil wars to conflicts between states. So they don't just have the political will, but they actually have the practical experience of deploying troops, mediating conflicts under the UN umbrella in all kinds of challenging environments.
So they're not just neutral.
Yeah.
In theory, they actually have a track record to back it up.
Yeah.
What kinds of, practical skills, what kind of on-the-ground experience are we talking about here?
It's really a broad range, On the more tactical side, they have a lot of experience with, the logistics of troop deployment, moving personnel and equipment in difficult terrain and things like demining, which unfortunately is going to be a really crucial issue in Ukraine. But it's not just about military skills. These countries also bring a lot of experience in, what are often called the softer elements of peacekeeping. So things like, mediating conflicts at the local level, building those positive relationships between the military personnel and the civilian population, and really working with communities to try to rebuild that social fabric to, create that long-term stability.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I mean, peacekeeping is not just about, soldiers standing guard. It's about really creating an environment where, things can go back to normal.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like the diversity, that exists within the Global South itself could actually be a real asset here.
Absolutely. Yeah. The analysis actually highlights that this diversity isn't just symbolic. It actually makes peacekeeping operations more effective.
What?
Because you have this broader range of expertise to draw upon. You have personnel who speak different languages, and crucially, you have a wider range of, cultural competencies. And this is so important when you're trying to engage with local populations, when you're trying to navigate, all the complexities of rebuilding a society after conflict.
Mm.
What works in one cultural context might completely backfire in another. So having that, diversity of experience within the peacekeeping force is a huge strength.
Okay, now one of the concerns that we hear, when it comes to peacekeeping forces from the global south, is this question of resources,
Hmm.
right? Do they have the same level of advanced military technology, or even just the financial resources that some Western militaries have? How does that factor into this whole discussion?
Yeah, it's a valid point. And resource constraints are definitely a reality for a lot of nations in the global south. But the way that a lot of these countries have adapted is by developing these really specialized capabilities. And a great example of this is Chile. Chile is actually world renowned for its expertise in humanitarian demining. Now, they might not have, the military budget of a major European power, but they've become leaders in this very specific and really crucial area. And when you think about what's happening in Ukraine, with all the landmines and unexploded ordnances, that kind of specialized knowledge and experience becomes invaluable.
So it's about focusing, your resources on specific needs and then really developing deep expertise, in those areas.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting, counter argument to that general concern about resources.
Well, yeah.
But beyond the practical capabilities, it seems like the most significant advantage for a global South-led mission might actually be in how it's perceived, right? How it's seen, in terms of its legitimacy on the world stage.
Yeah, that's arguably the most crucial factor. As the analysis points out, if you have a peacekeeping mission that's led mostly by Western powers, especially those in NATO, there's a big risk that a lot of people are going to see that as just, another extension of geopolitical rivalry. It could be interpreted as taking sides rather than actually, trying to be a neutral force. But if you have a mission that's spearheaded by nations from the global south, and especially if it's operating, with the legitimacy of a UN mandate, that's much more likely to get broader international support and trust. It's going to be seen as a more genuine attempt at peacemaking, not just by the countries involved in the conflict, but by, neutral states, by civil society groups around the world. And that kind of wider acceptance is really essential if you want any peacekeeping operation to be viable in the long term.
Okay, so a global South-led mission operating under the UN sounds promising, but what are the must-haves? What absolutely has to be in place to make this work on the ground in Ukraine?
The analysis lays out several, preconditions for success, and every single one is crucial. So first and foremost, you absolutely have to have a solid ceasefire, one that everyone involved has actually bought into and is committed to upholding. I mean, without that, without a stop to the fighting, no peacekeeping force is going to be able to operate safely or effectively. And then closely related to that, you have to have those front lines clearly demarcated. The peacekeepers need to know exactly where the boundaries are, who controls which areas.
Those sound like pretty basic things, but obviously absolutely essential.
Mm.
Where do we go from there?
Well, you absolutely need a clear and strong Security Council mandate. This is what gives the mission, its legal and moral authority under international law. This is what gives the peacekeeping force the legitimacy to operate in Ukraine and, the backing of the international community. And then the analysis also highlights that, you need logistical support, you need financial support, and that's probably going to have to come from Western nations. And this is key, it needs to happen without those countries actually sending in troops. That way you can have the resources you need to operate effectively, but you don't compromise, the perception of neutrality. And then finally, just to really drive home that neutrality and to address Russia's concerns, you'd have to specifically exclude any NATO troops from the peacekeeping force.
Okay, so it's a balancing act, right? You need to get the resources, you need the support you need, but you can't do it in a way that undermines the whole idea of neutrality.
Yeah.
And now the analysis that we've been focusing on, it really shines a light on one country in particular, as a potential leader for a Global South peacekeeping initiative, and that's India. What makes India so uniquely suited for this kind of role?
Well, there's several reasons why India really stands out. First of all, the track record in UN peacekeeping is really remarkable. Just the sheer numbers are impressive. Over 290,000 Indian peacekeepers have served in 50 different UN missions all over the world. And tragically, more than 160 Indian personnel have been killed while serving, in the cause of international peace. So that's a really deep and lasting commitment, to global peace and security.
Yeah, that's an incredible amount of experience and dedication.
Yeah.
And it's not just about the number of personnel either, right? It's also about the nature of their contributions.
Mm-hmm. Right, exactly. The analysis actually specifically mentions the all-women police contingent that India sent to Liberia, and that mission, it got a lot of recognition because of its really progressive approach. It was incredibly sensitive to the needs of the community,
Yeah.
in that post-conflict environment. And it really showed, a different and really effective model of peacekeeping, one that goes beyond, traditional military roles and really focuses on building trust, engaging with those local populations.
That's a really powerful example.
Yeah.
And of course, beyond, all that operational experience that India has, in peacekeeping, there's their, diplomatic standing, on the world stage.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, India's policy of non-alignment, which they've maintained for so long, and then the fact that they've really carefully cultivated balanced relationships with all the major players in the Ukraine conflict, that gives them a level of diplomatic credibility that's really hard to match. They're widely seen as a neutral player, someone who can talk to both sides. So that makes them, a natural candidate to lead this kind of initiative, one that could actually be seen as acceptable and trustworthy by everyone involved.
So it seems like, as we look at what might happen in Ukraine, whether we see some kind of lasting peace, it really all comes down to trust.
Yeah.
Right? Who can build that trust? Who can maintain it between all these different actors? And the analysis that we've been looking at today, it really lays out, a pretty compelling case.
It does. If we want a lasting peace in Ukraine, we need a peacekeeping force that's not just capable, on the ground, but one that's seen as credible and crucially neutral by everybody involved. Now, a European-led mission might seem like the obvious choice, just looking at geography, but the risk of making things worse, of destroying that fragile trust that's already there, that's a real danger.
Whereas, this idea of a UN-backed force led by nations from the global south that offers a different path.
Yeah.
That is a path that's rooted in those principles of fairness, international cooperation, and it's backed up by, a very real track record of, peacekeeping experience around the world.
And for India, and really for the whole, group of nations in the global south, this could be a huge moment. It's not just about helping to create peace in Ukraine. It's about potentially shifting, those global power dynamics. And it's a chance to really reinvigorate, the UN's peacekeeping mission in a world that's, becoming more and more complex and changing really rapidly.
But for you listening at home, especially for those of you who are preparing for the UPSC exams, think about this. As part of your daily UPSC mains or Lanka Maharashtra non-affairs study, then this is a really crucial topic, and it could be important for the prelims as well. Looking back, at the history of non-alignment and thinking about how the global order is changing, what do you think of the long-term implications of different countries, taking the lead in peacekeeping in these major conflicts?
It's a tough question, but it's an important one as we try to make sense of all these, complex global issues. This deep dive that we have done, looking at these different options for a peacekeeping force in Ukraine, it comes from analysis that was published in The Hindu. So if you found this discussion useful, and relevant to your understanding of these, global issues for your UPSC preparation, we encourage you to, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment, with any questions or thoughts that you might have. We always love to hear from you and to keep this important conversation going.